The year 1972 had shown the world that the United States and her OFN allies had gained the upper hand in the battle for global influence. Her German and Japanese adversaries faced setback after setback during the 1960s as members of their respective spheres left in favor of the OFN. Despite this, Germania and Tokyo still maintained the status of great powers in the world stage, as their spheres remained intact within Central Europe and East Asia respectively. The state of affairs would change as the two powers faced even greater challenges to their remaining hold on power, with the resurgence of Russia and China. The 20-year absence of Russia from world politics was a direct consequence of their defeat to Germany in the Second World War. Prior to the war, the communists in the Soviet Union had ruled over Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia under a federation. Power over the Union fell to the Communist Party, who presided over the fledgling Proletarian Republic, and to Nikolai Bukharin, who led the party after the death of Bolshevik extraordinaire Vladimir Lenin in 1924. Bukharin's tenure as premier would be characterized by the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which allowed peasants and farmers to sell grain in a partially regulated free market. To Bukharin, the NEP was a necessary stage in socialist construction by first allowing capitalism to develop. Although initially successful in increasing agricultural output, it would soon fail to meet the party's desired outcome. The NEP's grain output had not reached levels required for large-scale industrialization, while at the same time strengthening the power of large landowning farmers, or kulaks, who hoarded grain to sell at higher prices. As a result, a debate ensued within the Communist Party on whether to abandon the NEP in favor of collectivization. In the end, the NEP was abandoned and the Communist Party's policy took a leftwards turn. The implementation of collectivization in 1932 would be met with stiff resistance from kulaks as major uprisings occurred in the countryside. In face of this crisis, the Communist Party ordered the Red Army to restore order, which they succeeded by 1936. The failure of the NEP, the unrest in the countryside, the slow development of industry, and disunity within the Communist Party created the conditions for the Soviet Union's poor performance when war erupted with Germany. On the 22nd of June 1941, Soviet military positions were attacked by the German army without any declaration of war from the Reich, opening the Second World War's Eastern Front. The Eastern Front pitted the Red Army against the German army in an unprecedented industrial meat grinder. The initial fighting saw the Red Army retreat from their forward positions, forced to defend major cities as the German army advanced. Even though the Red Army fought with much determination, logistical issues would plague their continued war effort. Lost and damaged equipment in the battlefield could not be quickly replenished as a result of the Union's weak industrialization, impacting the overall capacity for the Red Army to effectively wage war. By December 1st, 1941, the German army had reached Moscow's outskirts, forcing Bukharin's government to evacuate the Kremlin. What ensued was 24 days of brutal urban warfare as the Red Army fought ferociously, defending Moscow street by street. In the end, Moscow would fall to Hitler's army, followed by Leningrad the months after. With the fall of these two major cities, heavy fighting shifted from North and Central Russia to the Caucasus region. In the wake of these military defeats, and in a time where the Soviet Union needed firm leadership, Premier Nikolai Bukharin suddenly disappeared. In his absence, National Economy Chairman and Bukharin ally Martyam Ryutin took it upon himself to lead the government. However, many within the CPSU blamed Bukharin's leadership for the disastrous war, chief among them being General Secretary Joseph Stalin. In a desperate gamble to save the Soviet Union from imminent defeat, Stalin launched a coup within the party. This plot was challenged by Ryutin, who published a document criticizing Stalin's actions with the hopes that he would step down. Ryutin utilized the Irkutsk agitprop office and ordered Mikhail Tomsky to publish and circulate the document across Siberia and Central Asia. The Irkutsk platform, as it would be known, failed to convince the Supreme Soviet to demote Stalin from his position as General Secretary. Although Stalin had won the initial confrontation, he would escalate the political situation by arresting Mikhail Tomsky. This escalation spooked both the old Bolsheviks and Interior Affairs Commissar Genrikh Yagoda. The old Bolsheviks believed that the arrest of a fellow comrade was unconscionable and that they were worried that they would be Stalin's next target. Meanwhile, Yagoda was shocked at Stalin's decision not to involve the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, or NKVD, with Tomsky's arrest, taking it as Stalin's lack of faith towards Yagoda. As a result, the NKVD would not support Stalin in his bid for power. The situation quickly deteriorated as Stalin and Bukharin supporters took up arms against one another, starting the Second Russian Civil War. In the wake of this conflict, Genrikh Yagoda mobilized the NKVD to evacuate the remnants of the non-factional Soviet government eastwards, towards Irkutsk. This new Irkutsk Soviet government lacked the bureaucratic and military capacity to enforce its sovereignty across the remaining Soviet Union, creating a power vacuum. In place of the Soviet government, new local authorities asserted their hold over different regions. In the industrialized heartland of Central Siberia, an uneasy alliance had formed between the industrial managers, petty bourgeois Democrats, and mutinous military officers who declared the formation of a Central Siberian Republic in Tomsk. In an attempt to restore the Soviet Union's hold over Siberia, Genrikh Yagoda authorized a military buildup in Central Siberia. In response, the Central Siberian Republic mobilized to counteract the Soviet incursion. The Siberian War, as it would be known, erupted in May 1950 as Red Army soldiers marched into Central Siberia. The war quickly turned into a stalemate as both sides struggled to push the other. With the Red Army tied up in Central Siberia, dissident elements in the Far East made their move and launched insurrections in Chita, Magadan, and Zeya. Seeing Yagoda's authority crumble in the Far East, the Central Siberian Republic would start their own offensive against the Red Army. Despite hopes of a successful counterattack, the Republican Army would fail to take advantage of the situation as their own offensive stalled. Imitating the political situation in the Far East, Central Siberia would also suffer from insurrection. Resistance in the Central Siberian Republic would spawn from the disaffection of factory workers and peasants who were forced to fight a war which they had no stake in. Soon, these elements united with mutinous military men to form the anarchist Siberian Black Army. The Black Army's rebellion was followed by several failed attempts by Tomsk to forcefully suppress the uprising. The failure of that campaign led to the commanding general, Nikolai Krylov, to defect, proclaiming himself to be the successor of the ancient Rurkid dynasty and establishing a polity in Kemerovo. The Republic's failures led to a complete collapse of the uneasy alliance between the petty bourgeois Democrats, industrial managers, and military as each side lost faith in the other. What was left of the government remained in Tomsk. This government was mainly comprised of the liberal intelligentsia, the main power brokers of the city's salons. Meanwhile, the industrial managers and their military allies aligned themselves with the governor of Novosibirsk, Alexander Pokrishkin, who seceded from the Republic as a result of the crisis. As the conflict subsided, it became clear to everyone the authority which existed in Central Siberia no longer held sovereignty. The provisional government in Tomsk quickly insulated itself from regional politics, as factions of the intelligentsia argued amongst themselves about the direction of the Republic. The retreat of Tomsk gave way to the rise of Novosibirsk as the eminent regional power in Siberia. Upon seceding from the Central Siberian Republic, Alexander Pokrishkin and his industrial allies reorganized their state into the Federation of Novosibirsk and Altai in 1956. Pokrishkin and other similar warlords suddenly found themselves in charge of the fragments of a ruined Russia. The task fell on these new upstart warlords to reconstruct and reunify the shattered remnants of the Soviet Union, which had faced a decade of administrative neglect, economic devastation, and civil war. Unlike the other warlords, however, Novosibirsk inherited a large industrial base courtesy of Bukharin's Siberian industrial project. It was through this industrial base that Novosibirsk was able to field a large, well-equipped army. In June 1963, Pokrishkin would go on the offensive against the warlords of Central Siberia. His army first set its sights on their former comrades turned enemies in Tomsk, which had come under the control of the Utopians led by Dmitry Shostakovich. The war would start with light skirmishing on both sides, as had become expected during the Russian Smuta. However, the Novosibirsk army quickly mobilized a combined arms offensive against Tomsk in an attempt to capture the city, to their enemy's surprise. Despite the best efforts of the Tomsk army, their position quickly became untenable as artillery and bombs rained around them. Even the most hopeful idealist in Tomsk realized how dire the situation had become. They would announce their surrender to Novosibirsk 2 months after the start of the offensive. The insurrectionary governor Pakryshkin had come out on top in the struggle against the Central Siberian Republic. The president wasted no time in taking advantage of the momentum as he pivoted his army south to crush the anarchist Black Army. By mid-1964, Pakryshkin had demonstrated his complete sovereignty over Central Siberia. Upon Novosibirsk's victory, President Pakryshkin found himself inheriting a region with an already developed industrial sector and a sizable agricultural sector. Industry in Central Siberia can be organized into two categories: resource extraction and manufacturing. Of the two, resource extraction was the larger sector as it accounted for more than half of the region's productive output. Specifically, the coal mining operations were of much importance to the corporations of Central Siberia. These resources would find themselves either exported to the Japanese market through Mongolia and northern China, or sold to the black markets of Russia. Trade between the Russian warlord statelets provided the Novosibirsk-based corporations with much-needed capital, which were reinvested into the regional economy. However, the fruitful profits of Siberian industry would not be enjoyed equally by all stratas of social life. While the industrial managers lived lavishly from the profits, the living conditions for the workers of the mines, factories, and farmlands remained stagnant. These neglected sections of Siberian society made up the foundations of a revolt that would challenge the order presented by Pakryshkin and the Siloviki. Under the leadership of a mining foreman by the name of Vitaly Kostin, the workers of Siberia took up arms against the bourgeois Siberian government. The revolt consisted of disaffected workers who organized themselves into Soviets, as well as roving bands of armed men who had lost their occupation upon Novosibirsk's victory. Vitaly Kostin harnessed the energies of these peoples towards a political project, the restoration of socialism and proletarian supremacy in Central Siberia. Their power base was centered right at the heart of Novosibirsk itself. Pakryshkin and his cabinet had not imagined that the social situation would deteriorate this badly. Urged by his allies in the industrial bourgeoisie, he announced martial law and a subsequent campaign to suppress the workers' revolt. Pakryshkin outlined a battle plan: enter the city, disarm the workers, end unlawful assembly, and summarily execute anyone who illegally exercises functions of authority. For 2 months, the Federation's troops bitterly fought the armed workers to restore order in Novosibirsk and the surrounding countryside. When the dust settled, Pakryshkin and the forces of order emerged victorious in the conflict. The revolt's disastrous outcome cemented the position of the industrial bourgeoisie in Central Siberia. While Pakryshkin busied himself with squashing the workers' revolt in mid-1964, other developments occurred in the Russian Smuta. To the east, a new power had successfully established sovereignty over far eastern Siberia. The Chita-based Far Eastern Imperial Realm, led by Tsar Mikhail Andreevich Romanov. These monarchists consisted of Russian emigres from Harbin and were of the many groups that launched an insurrection against King Yagoda during the Central Siberian War with the hopes of restoring the old Russian Empire. Between 1964 and 1969, an uneasy peace persisted between Pakryshkin's Federation and Mikhail's Imperial Realm. Under these conditions, banditry and warlordism had been reduced to pre-war levels. This reduced the risk of economic activities such as trade between the Central and Far Eastern Siberia. Chita would quickly become reliant on coal and grain imported from Central Siberia's industrial and agricultural centers. Meanwhile, workers in the Far East began to seasonally migrate to Central Siberia in search of better employment opportunities. In conjunction with these developments, the industrial corporations of Novosibirsk obtained project contracts in the Far East to initiate mining and logging operations. The political implication of pan-Siberian economic integration was not lost on Novosibirsk's decision-makers. 5 years of economic cooperation and cordial diplomatic relations between Novosibirsk and Chita culminated in the Pan-Siberian Summit in late 1969. The two heads of states, the Old Russia and the New Russia, the Tsar and the President, met in Irkutsk and then Kansk for several rounds of negotiations. At the onset of these negotiations, it was clear to most that Novosibirsk held the upper hand. After all, it had all the economic leverage. This was made even clearer when the outcome of the summit had become public. The two states would unify into the Siberian Federation, a presidential republic with all the political structures of Novosibirsk. to convince the old monarchist generals and their emperor to retire their political ambitions, they would be given a hefty annual state pension. On the eve of October 19, 1969, a ceremony would be held in the city of Novosibirsk to celebrate the unification of Siberia. President Pokryshkin stood side by side with Tsar Mikhail throughout the ceremony. By the end of the pleasantries, the Tsar would once more become Citizen Romanov. The peace that prevailed in Siberia was not an inevitable state of affairs and would contrast heavily with the political situation in West Russia. In the West, the two major players in this part of the Russian Smuta were the West Russian Revolutionary Front and the West Siberian Provisional Authority. The West Russian Revolutionary Front, or the Revolutionary Front for short, is made up of the tattered remnants of the old Red Army. While a shadow of its former self, the front, led by Marshal Zhukov, desired the restoration of the Soviet Union. After decades of civil war, the front had proved themselves to be capable fighters and administrators in their own right. But their capabilities would be put to the test when in May 1969, the Revolutionary Front went to war with the Black League's West Siberian Provisional Authority. The Black League was an anti-colonial resistance organization based in the West Siberian city of Omsk, whose stated goal was the end of German settler colonialism in Eastern Europe and the dissolution of Germany as a whole. They were a hardline organization and desired the unification of Russia under their rule, refusing to cooperate with ideologically aligned organizations. This hardline stance would set the Black League on a collision course with the Revolutionary Front. The war between the Front and the Black League would turn out bloody and disastrous for the population, who were forced to endure yet another round of violence. Combat in the early stages of the war centered around the many mountain passes of the Urals. Sporadic clashes occurred all across the passes as the Revolutionary Front's positions were attacked. The Black League took the initiative and launched several offensives through the passes with motorized infantry and artillery. This offensive was countered by the Revolutionary Front's own armored columns, who tore through the League's initial assault. The first offensive left charred remains of trucks and armored half-tracks littered across the mountain passes. Undeterred by these mounting losses, the Black League initiated yet another offensive in April 1970, this time targeting the weaker positions of the South Urals. This concentrated assault would catch the Revolutionary Front off guard, as it exposed the northern positions to a flanking maneuver from the south. To offset the risks of an encirclement, the front retreated from their positions on the Ural mountain passes. However, by abandoning the defenses of the Urals, the front had traded away their greatest strategic advantage. This opportunity was not lost on the Black League's commanders, who immediately ordered motorized units to push forward in pursuit of the retreating Red Army. Despite this setback, the front would hold out their positions to the best of their abilities, preventing the Black League from achieving a quick and bloodless victory. Every city that the League captured would cost them much-needed small arms, trucks, and manpower. After 3 more months of costly mobile combat, the soldiers of the League were at the outskirts of the Revolutionary Front's capital in Vyatka. To spare the lives of the city's inhabitants, the Revolutionary Front's leadership announced their withdrawal and immediate capitulation to the Black League. Upon their victory on July 10, 1970, Black League Commander-in-Chief Dmitry Azov announced in Omsk the creation of the Russian National Reclamation Government, or NRG for short. Although jubilant about their victory over the Revolutionary Front, the NRG's leadership had to contend with the reality that their war had destroyed much of West Russia's critical infrastructure and industry. Large-scale industries either faced strategic bombing or artillery fire from the Black League's army, while smaller enterprises, mostly worker co-ops, voluntarily closed down to avoid extortion. The economic situation was compounded by a political situation of equal urgency. While the Revolutionary Front's armies had formally surrendered to the NRG, tens of thousands of soldiers refused to give up their arms and by extension give up socialism to the nationalists. These soldiers would be a constant thorn to the side of the NRG's reconstruction plans, as trucks and trains became common targets of communist ambushes. Comparing the political and economic situation of the NRG and the Siberian Federation as the two remaining governments in the Russian Smuta, one could argue easily that the Federation was in the better position for reunification, especially in the event of an armed conflict. For one, it had not condemned its region to a fratricidal bloodbath as the reclamation government had done. In absence of such a regional war, the Federation was able to funnel their productive capital towards economic development. In contrast, the NRG had little resources to spare outside of war expenses, which had an undoubtedly adverse effect on their economic growth, with a measly 4.69% GDP growth rate in 1972. In contrast, the Siberian Federation's GDP growth in the same year was 10.2%, far surpassing that of Omsk. Despite this, the Reclamation government's GDP numbered $33 billion, higher than the Siberian Federation's $27 billion. The $6 billion GDP difference is to be expected, since West Russia is home to a larger population and by extension higher concentration of economic activity. However, the form of economic activity which took place in West Russia was not as productive nor organized as Siberia. The carcass of the Revolutionary Front's cooperative socialist system underwent a process of expropriation by the Reclamation government's military apparatus. This expropriation derailed industrial production in West Russia and resulted in numerous industrial disputes. For example, when NRG authorities attempted to restructure management in a cooperative shoe factory in Kazan, the organized workers shot the representatives dead. In response, the army was sent to besiege the rebellious factory. The resulting violence left half of the workers dead and gave the army no choice but to fill those empty ranks with armed conscripts. This dire economic situation certainly limited the NRG's military capacity. By early 1972, Omsk could only field 591,000 soldiers with 2.35 million reserves and 100 jet fighters. In comparison, the Siberian Federation fielded 1.36 million men with 3.33 million in reserves and 1,000 jet fighters. The capabilities of these two Russian giants would be put to the final test in a military confrontation. The deadly West Russian Civil War and the subsequent destruction of the West Russian Revolutionary Front had alarmed Pakryshkin and his inner circle, who dreaded the possibility of facing off Marshal Yazov and his National Reclamation Army in an armed conflict. The ferocity of the Black League's army had become notorious across Russia. Their use of chemical weapons, heavy artillery shelling, and lack of concern for civilian lives were a main source of those fears. Civilians fleeing from the fighting had often brought with them stories of encountering the Reclamation Army. This was a deliberate propaganda strategy from Omsk to dissuade enemies from attacking, and it certainly almost worked with Federation President Pakryshkin. But underneath the propaganda lay a deeper truth, that the NRG was unprepared to face off the Siberian Federation in a war. Although all factors had indicated a victory for Novosibirsk, many within the ministry, including Pakryshkin himself, still hesitated at the prospect of all-out war with the NRG. They hesitated at the potential human toll, the economic damage, and the possibility of German or Japanese intervention. Nonetheless, preparations for war were made with the construction of airstrips and defensive fortifications, as well as military training which took place all across the Siberian-Russian border. Tensions peaked when Federation anti-air systems shot down an NRG reconnaissance plane. The pilots were captured, upon which the NRG demanded their release, but Novosibirsk had little time for negotiations. Quickly, both sides mobilized their armies to the front lines. The NRG sent a final ultimatum to Novosibirsk on February 1, 1972, with a deadline on the 4th. President Pakryshkin sent no response to the ultimatum, igniting war between the two last Russias. The Federation would strike first, making use of its air supremacy. NRG supply depots, military command posts, and airfields were struck in the first 4 hours of the conflict. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Reclamation Army was unable to take the initiative. The Siberian Army had all the advantages in number, technology, and military preparedness that the Reclamation Army could not keep up. The Siberian Army's first objective was to cut off the city of Omsk from the rest of their territory. This was achieved in the first 2 months of the war. With Omsk separated, the Siberian Army and the Reclamation Army battled across the Urals and West Russia. However, the Reclamation Army would slowly retreat from their positions. The NRG's reliance on artillery and motorized infantry put them at a severe disadvantage as they faced off against the Siberian Army's modern armor. City after city fell to the marching Siberian Army, but not without incident. Before retreating, the NRG would indiscriminately unleash chemical weapons onto the civilian population, as to slow down the Siberian Army's advance. Nevertheless, NRG presence in West Russia was all but gone by August of 1972, and a few days later, Dmitry Yazov's fortress in Omsk would also fall. Upon seizing the Black League's capital, now Federation President Vasily Shukshin proclaimed the formation of the Russian Federation on September 3, 1972. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Militarist-Industrialist Alliance in Novosibirsk were able to use their economic and military strength, as well as their distance from Germany, to unite Russia, defeating rival governments and ending the Smuta. Having been able to internally consolidate, President Shukshin began to look outwards, setting them on a devastating collision course that would go on to define the next decade.